and I was a little nervous about it. I was just having a low moment. I was getting nervous about it. And I ended up leaving Rollins at sunset and starting to ride into the Great Basin at night after dark. And it was totally dark. And I was riding into this area that I had some fear about and just riding into the dark. There were no lights. This is a very remote area. So pitch black. So all I have is my little headlamp on the bike. And it ended up being, again, this wonderful moment. I turned off my light and I looked up and there were all of these stars. There were so many stars. It was just, you couldn't even imagine that many stars. I'd never seen a sky like that before.
Welcome to the Seek Travel Ride podcast, where we share the stories and experiences of people who have undertaken amazing adventures by bike. Whether it's crossing state borders, mountain ranges, countries or continents, we want to share that spirit of adventuring on two wheels with our listeners. Hello everyone, welcome to Seek Travel Ride. It's Bella Malloy here, host of the show. I'm really excited for this episode because it is a milestone for the podcast. This is episode number 50. Never could I have guessed that the podcast would have grown so much when I first pressed record way back in January 2023 for my very first interview. Since then, I've had the absolute pleasure of sharing the stories of some incredible guests, and it's been a joy to hear them share their experiences with you, my listeners. This show has become global. We have listeners now based in over 113 countries, 2,750 plus cities all around the world. And it fills me with joy to know that a lot of you, my listeners, are actually listening and tuning in to Seek Travel Ride as you are midway through your adventure too. I see you and I thank you for your support. If you're new to the show, definitely take the time to check out the back catalogue. As I mentioned, with 50 episodes now, there are so many amazing guest stories for you to dig into there. While adventuring on a bike is the common element for the show, I know many will agree with me when I say it is actually the human interest stories behind each guest's decision to take that adventure, which really piques all of our interests and why we tune in each week. If you'd like to help the show celebrate this week, please feel free to share it across your socials and celebrate this 50th episode milestone. If you'd like to get involved in the Seek Travel Ride community, check us out on our Facebook group. You can find the link to that in the show notes. And without further ado, let's dig into this episode number 50 with our guest, Laura Killingbeck. Hello, I'm your host, Bella Malloy, and I'm excited to introduce my guest for today's episode of Seek Travel Ride, Laura Killingbeck. When Laura was 23, she realised she wanted more from life, and so she sold all her possessions, bought a one-way ticket to Alaska, and started out on a bicycle tour that would take her all the way down to San Francisco. From there, she hitchhiked to Costa Rica, where she'd spend the next 13 years living and working in experimental communities. This lifestyle of communal living taught Laura a lot, but this year she decided she needed to break free, leave that environment, and much like that time 15 years ago, she decided to once again set off on a bicycle and start pedaling. Over a period of 8.5 months, Laura made her way across the US and Canada. During this trip, she cycled the Pacific Coast Road, the Chihuahuan Connector, and the length of the Great Divide. During this time, she also spent 3 months living in desert caves, seeking out immersive experiences and being alone in nature. I'm really looking forward to speaking with Laura today and finding out more about her experiences, learnings, and insights that she's taken from this transformative travel adventure of hers. Laura, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Bella. It's great to be here.
Oh, Laura, I am super duper excited for this chat with you. I feel like I've been given this amazing gift where I have the opportunity to listen to someone tell their story. And as I mentioned there in my introduction, one that I feel has been quite transformative for you as well, because you have experienced so much. And I'm looking forward to getting insights to that. But Laura, a question which I always like to start my podcast with, and I ask this of all my guests, is, do you remember the very first bike you ever rode?
Yeah, so I've been thinking about that, and I did ride around as a kid on a bike, but the first bike that I have a really strong memory of is my first adult bike, actually. And so when I was in, I think it was my late teenage years, I purchased a Windsor Tourist online. And so it was this old touring bike, and I didn't have a plan for it at the time, but I think I was just kind of setting myself up for whatever journey would happen because I specifically bought a touring bike and I just like had it ready and waiting for whatever would happen.
Far out. When you think about it, and when I think about people's experiences of bikes, especially if they're buying one as an adult, right, and then later in life, generally you're choosing a bike on a theme of what you want to do. So, for example, my first bike, I loved cycling as a kid, didn't do any of it all when I was a teenager. Then my first bike that I bought was a mountain bike, primarily because I met my now husband and maybe just remembered that I liked riding bikes, but he'd gotten into mountain biking, so I bought a bike that could let me do that. You're talking about borrowing a touring bike, never toured, but obviously this sense, this internal sense for you for travel and exploration lies deep. And as you say, it was there and there was something that set you off on that path. Have you always sort of had a relationship with and a yearning for the outdoors and travel and adventure then growing up?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I grew up in Rhode Island in the United States, and both of my parents are naturalists. So we would spend a lot of time outside as kids. I have an older brother, and we would spend time in national parks, we'd go camping, and my parents just encouraged us to play in the yard a lot, which I think is just so crucial for kids because we just had a lot of time outside just playing in the dirt, and it made me really, really comfortable with nature. And so even as a teenager, I really had this very strong feeling like I wanted to be wild, to be honest with you, from a very young age. I was a really good student. I checked off all the boxes of doing all the things I needed to do in school, in high school. But I had this feeling like I just couldn't see myself in society. I just couldn't figure out where I would fit in there. And so when I was 18, I ended up packing a backpack full of camping gear. I took a Greyhound to Tucson, Arizona, and I walked to the highway and I actually just hitchhiked away. So I got my adventure start as a teenage girl, hitchhiking around the southwestern United States and then down to Mexico. I hitchhiked across Mexico, met a Mexican shoe shiner, jumped a freight train, lived with his family in Puebla. I spent a whole year camping wherever I landed and just really seeking to explore the world and understand what was out there, like understand the nooks and crannies and just get a different perspective that I couldn't have gotten otherwise. So that quest for adventure has always been a part of me.
Wow. For those listening, I spoke with Laura briefly before we pressed record, and I know I said it to you, Laura, then, but I fully believe I could do so many podcasts on so many different facets of your story. And hitchhiking as an 18-year-old to try and figure out where you sit in this world and how to make sense of it all. But also, I can just only imagine the interactions that you would have had with people on along that time as well.
Yeah.
And I feel this strongly about the way that you have traveled, regardless of which trip we're talking about, is that you feel things deeply. And so it comes across to me just the way that you express yourself. So I imagine that in all these experiences, you are fully immersed, which means that from an emotional perspective, you're feeling those extreme highs, and there's probably times where you felt extreme lows as well.
Yes.
What was it like as an 18-year-old, hitchhiking by the roadside, and how did people receive you that way?
Yeah, well, thank you. You really, yeah, you hit it on the nose. I do feel things deeply, and I think it's funny because I am kind of a quiet person. I'm like an introspective person. I'm risk averse. I would describe myself as risk averse, but I have these big experiences, which I think is kind of a mirror of my inner world. It's an intense place. I am just so fascinated by the entire world and everything that goes on. And so hitchhiking as an 18-year-old, I mean, I had no idea what I was doing. The first time I stuck out my thumb, I was standing there. I was like, I have no idea. How do I hitchhike? The first guy who stopped for me, I assumed he'd run out of gas. I was like, there's no way he was stopping for me, And so finally, went up, got in the car, and he had stopped for me. Yeah, so I met a lot of wonderful people. People were very protective of me. People wanted to help me. People wanted to make sure that I was okay. A lot of people told me their stories. One of the brilliant things about hitchhiking is you get people who just want to talk to you and they'll tell you their story, their life story. And so, as an 18-year-old girl, I was getting in these cars, I was hearing people's stories from all walks of life who had all these different experiences that they wanted to share. And so it was a really special thing to be able to get that insight into people's lives at a young age. I was also living in cities. Sometimes I'd get stuck in cities and I would live with homeless communities there, houseless communities, because those were the people who knew where to sleep. And they would always help me and find out where to sleep. So I was just seeing the world from different angles.
Really different angles. And again, those experiences, those human connections that you're making along the way go further than what you would learn in a classroom setting, in a university lecture theatre, or even reading from someone else's perspective. You've fully immersed there as well. I mentioned in my introduction, Laura, that as a 23-year-old, you realised life wasn't going the way that you wanted to. And so you again set out, similar, I guess, to the way this 18-year-old did, to break free, set out, go on another transformative experience and break free and make a change. Do you want to give some background into what was the catalyst for that?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so after that year of hitchhiking, I went back to Rhode Island and I started college. So I was studying sociology and philosophy. And during that time, that first year, I decided that I really just needed to focus on the outdoors again and nature. And I had found this brochure for the National Outdoor Leadership School for this mountaineering course that I really wanted to take, but it was really expensive for me at the time. And so I was like, all right, I need to make this money. I need to go on this mountaineering course. And I ended up getting a job at a strip club to earn money for this mountaineering course. Yeah, it was very out of character. I didn't even shave my legs at the time. I mean, it was just totally like, I'm going mountaineering. This is how I'm getting there. So I ended up working in this club. And again, it was, with my personality, it's like I am engaged. I am engaged in this experience. I want to know what it is. I want to be there. I want to be part of whatever this is and understand it. And so it's very intense. And I definitely got caught up in a fascinating industry, but also a toxic one. And so there was a lot of toxicity there. And there was this one moment. I'd been working there for a little while and it just was getting to me to this point where I just didn't know how to process what was happening anymore. I went home, I opened my laptop, and I just kind of had this fantasy where I was like, I'm going to look at flights like, to anywhere in the world. So I was kind of perusing flights and I happened to find this cheap flight to Iceland. Didn't intend to buy it, but I did. So I bought it. It was leaving for the following weekend and coming back a month later. So suddenly I had this escape from this job that I didn't know how to really get myself out of. And after I bought the ticket, I was like, all right, what am I going to do in Iceland? I happened to have this touring bike that I had purchased earlier. I had never ridden it more than like 20 miles, but I was like, all right, I'm going to ride this bike around Iceland. Like, this is the answer, you know? And so I figured out how to box up this bike. I got some panniers, and the next weekend I was on this flight to Iceland, biked out of the airport, and spent the next month biking around Iceland. It was absolutely magical. I think I was 21 years old. I didn't know anything about cycling, so there were a lot of issues with the bike and how to ride and all that stuff. But I was very comfortable camping on my own. I'd already done that year as an 18-year-old. So it was just a magical, magical ride. And ended up coming back after that month, really rejuvenated. By then, I had finished my college classes, and my best friend, who was also had been working as a dancer, decided to move out to California to go to this really great club that she had found. And so I was like, oh, I'll move with you. And so we went out to California so that she could dance at this club. long story short, I ended up working at that club. I got back into the industry and started working again. And the same thing happened where it was just like, there's this fascinating job. There's so much that's interesting about it. There was so much that was just like, you're seeing this side of people that's very raw, that's very revealing, not just revealing for the women who are there, but you're seeing the side of these men that are coming into this club. And it was very alluring to me. But again, toxic industry, addictive industry, I got in way over my head. It no longer felt safe. And again, it was like I had gotten to the edge. I got into the very edge of what that experience was, and then I had to leave it because I'd gotten to that edge. So that is when at 23, I got rid of my stuff and booked a one-way ticket to Alaska with this idea that I was going to bike south and figure it out on the way. That was the plan, is bike south and figure it out on the way. And I did.
Far out. Wow. Oh, my head is racing with so many questions about this, Laura, but I feel like just listening you tell this story. And again, to my listeners, I think you probably agree with me. You can tell, Laura, you feel things deeply. You're fully immersed in this. Can I just say, as an aside, your trip to Iceland, I feel like you were discovering Iceland by bike before it was cool, because that is a destination so many
Yeah.
people now go, oh, let's go bikepacking in Iceland, and that is like a go-to place.
Yeah.
Wow. Do you feel it was your experience there on that trip in Iceland that made you decide later on, when you'd come back into that toxic industry, as you said, you were way in over your head, it didn't feel safe anymore? Did your experiences on the bike, was that something that pushed you to wanting to break free and just go on, set off, head to Alaska, take your bike and just get out into nature again? Or is that just you being someone that thrives in the outside environment? Were you sort of looking to put yourself in a place, I guess, at a junction when you're feeling not safe, vulnerable? Are you looking to take yourself somewhere where I guess you felt safe again, which is the outside?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that nature for me has always been a really safe place. I really think of nature speaks the pattern language of the soul. It's, if you need to reattune yourself, if you need to realign yourself, if you need to find something out about yourself, I think you can go outside, you can go to nature, and just the being in there, being immersed in that experience is so profound that it does what it needs to do. And that's always worked for me.
Something there that you talk about, and you said nature is the pattern language of the world. There was a quote that I came up with, and I wanted to bring it up later in the show, but it just feels relevant to bring it up now. And it's a quote from you where, from chaos rise patterns, and the kindness of humans is one of the most consistent patterns I've ever experienced. You talk about nature having its own patterns, but again, this idea that there's patterns that emerge, that you're able to draw from these experiences as well. It's something that I feel is deep within you.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of these experiences appear to be chaotic in some way. You're going into the unknown, going into, going on these long journeys. Anything could happen. There's a lot of mystery. But in the midst of all of that unknown, in the midst of that mystery, I think the pattern of just the truth about what the world is constantly rising. It's constantly coming out. It's constantly presenting itself. And in nature, for me, that pattern is safety and joy. And I think the pattern of humans that I've seen over and over again in all of my journeys and throughout my whole life and everything I've done is that people are fundamentally programmed to really want to connect with each other. There is kindness there over and over again in every situation. It doesn't mean that kindness is guaranteed. It doesn't mean that anything is guaranteed, but people choose kindness over and over again. And that is one of the fundamental patterns of the world.
Hello, listeners. It's Bella here, host of the show. Now, One of the things I love about podcasting is knowing that when I press record, while the session may just be me and my guests, I know that that conversation is really being heard by many thousands of people all around the world. With every episode I release, I always consider you to be an integral part of each interview I conduct and the show that I produce. From conducting my research to asking those interview questions to editing and releasing each episode, all of this done with you, the listener, in my mind. It's because of this that I really value being able to hear directly from you so that I can continue to enhance your podcast listening experience. What I am seeking from you now is your input into a survey that I have put together. And I appreciate the time you're taking to just go to that survey. I've linked it in the show notes and have you share your thoughts with me here. It's just a few short questions to just see what you value about the show, what you look forward to the most, and also maybe how you see the future of the show as well. Once again, thank you for being an integral part of the Seek Travel Ride community. Now, let's get back to the show. It's interesting because what occurs to me, Laura, is that you've been able to draw on that and learn that. But the only way that you possibly could learn that insight is from the act of doing, and doing in the way that you have done things as well, putting yourself in those vulnerable situations. And whether that's the vulnerability of sticking a thumb out on a highway and hitchhiking, to flying to a faraway country like Iceland and not knowing what you're doing on a bike in the cold and the extremes there, to being in a strip club setting and working in an environment that most of us are probably don't have a clue about, to be honest with you, to then the vulnerability of setting out without anything in mind other than just pedaling forward from Alaska. I don't own anything except what's on my bike now, and just being vulnerable as a solo traveler as well.
Yeah.
You've drawn so many learnings from that. When you set off from Alaska, what were your expectations? Like you said you were just heading to California and you'd figure it out along the way. Did you have expectations for yourself?
No, I really didn't know. I didn't have a timeline. I didn't have a destination, and that was actually intentional. I wanted to have an experience where I would be able to engage with those moments, the moment of being on the bike, the moment of being in my body, the moment of being part of the world. I didn't want to have any kind of other metric. I didn't want to have distance as a metric or speed as a metric. I didn't want to be doing anything for a reason that was outside of the moment itself. Yeah.
Just being completely mindful in that. And it comes across then. There's some people that I speak to that go on bike tours and everything is planned to the infinite detail. And I have friends like this as well, where their security and their safety is in certainty. And so certainty of where am I going? Where will I be on this day? Where am I staying? What am I doing? What am I going to see? Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, a lot of my guests are exactly like yourself. I think of lines like, my plan is there is no plan, like there is no route, it is whatever the day brings. And you definitely are someone that would fit into that latter category. I guess when we talk about moments, and there's experiences that happen to each of us in lives which are impactful and ones that change us. And something that I came across which definitely changed you was you met a beautiful person during your time on this trip. And that person was Jen, and you met her on the Great Divide. Or she was doing the Great Divide, from what I understand. Can you tell me a bit about that experience and how that sort of shaped a lot of what you took going forward?
Sure, yeah. So the ride going south out of Alaska was mostly solo it was solo from Alaska down to the U.S. border. And so I spent a lot of alone time. There were several families that took me in along the way and like just picked me up in a grocery store and brought me home with them for the night. And so like there was a lot of like those things were happening to me, which was so beautiful and just so life affirming, but I was very alone for a lot of that trip. And then once I got down to the US border into Washington and Oregon, I started seeing all these people riding bikes. I hadn't realized that there was a bike route there. So the Pacific Coast Bike Route, which was mapped by the Adventure Cycling Association, goes down the whole Pacific coast of the US. And I had like gotten onto this route just accidentally. I didn't have a GPS or a phone or anything with me on that ride. I was just following a paper road map. I didn't know there was a bike route. So I got on this bike route, started meeting other people. And one of those people that I met was Jen. Jen had just raced the Great Divide on a single speed. And she was this tiny little person. She just raced this monster race so fast.
Legend.
Yeah, legend. Jen was a legend. And I just happened to meet her on this ride. And, I was on this ride because I had all these things to escape from and also run towards and like finding these intense moments. And Jen just was so radiant. She just had this like what just seemed like this inner joy. And I remember talking to her and just asking her, I was so like awestruck by her. She'd raced this massive route. And I remember talking to her and I was like, why are you racing over these mountains? What is it? And she's just like, I just love biking. She just loved it. She loved being on her bike every day. And it changed something in my mind. It just changed the way I thought about it. He was like, oh, you can just be out here because you love to be out here. And there's something special and profound and healthy about that. And that really shaped me. And so I didn't meet her for very long. I hardly spent that much time with her down the coast. We rode together for just a short ways, but she stayed with me through my life. I kind of had this image of her in my mind, like as I went on in my life, because she said she rode her bike every day. And so it was like this inner clock where I was like, I know Jen's riding today, and it was cool.
What a cool thing to sort of just think randomly, oh, Jenny would be riding today. That's a cool moment. But also something that she shared with you that drew things back to being so simple, because often I think we can take these trips looking for the big neon flashing sign reason as to the why. Jen's why was simple of, I don't need anything big. I just love being out here and I love riding my bike. And that stood out starkly to you as well.
Yeah, it was really just such a special moment to see someone just finding joy in as they were, you know? Yeah.
And so that trip, I mentioned, and for my listeners, it's always a struggle when people have done so many different things as Laura has done, because you feel like you're skipping over things when you can go into the details. But the details of this podcast is going to be coming into Laura's most recent trip. So we don't dive into the details of this particular one, but you do find yourself there then at the end of that trip in San Francisco. Did you feel you had drawn answers from that, or your journey still required you to continue on forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of the answers that come out of these trips are answers that come to you throughout the rest of your whole life. These are raw moments in time. You're out there, you're experiencing all of these things, and then I think it's in that afterwards that kind of coalesces into who you are. And so that journey, I think, made me a lot stronger, it made me a lot happier. It did allow me to move on with my life. I applied for jobs at public libraries along the route. So while I was biking along and pull over at the library and apply for some jobs. So I got a job after that on a chainsaw crew in Colorado. So after that trip was over, I moved to Colorado and I started working with chainsaws, which it was perfect. I loved it.
I'm just thinking of the jobs that you've had, and we're just talking about 3 here, and I know you've had so many more, but we're going to put, a dancer in a strip club, a librarian, someone,
Well,
and a chainsaw crew. It's so 3 different things, and if you...
oh well, I didn't work as a librarian. I just applied for jobs in the
But
library.
even the
But
idea, I
yeah,
love that as an idea, that the same person can do these roles.
yes.
And it says something about your personality as well, Laura, because it tells me that you're someone you're adaptable, you transform, you try new things, you want new experiences. So you don't tell yourself, no, you can't do things. You're always pushing yourself as to why you can keep trying. And I bring that up because I do remember coming across one of your posts a few months ago while you were still writing, and you were talking about you were struggling. It was a really tough climb. It must have been somewhere on the Great Divide, and it's remiss of me, I can't remember the exact point on here, but you were meeting people along the way. There was a massive wild storm that took place, and people were telling you it was really hard on the uphill, but the downhill is going to be really hard, and whether you should do it or not. But you didn't listen to people tell you why you couldn't do things. You just allowed yourself to give it a go. And I love that about you, and that sort of really comes across.
Thank you. Yeah, wow.
Okay, you end up in San Francisco, you're still moving forward. And as I mentioned in my introduction, you end up making your way all the way to Costa Rica,
Yeah.
where your life again changes dramatically once more. Talk me through that experience.
Yeah, so I worked on the chainsaw crew for a season. It was a great job. While I was there, I wanted to move on after the job was over, and I was thinking about hitchhiking again down south. And so I happened to go to a party one night, and I met a guy there, and I was like, "Hey, do you want to come hitchhike with me to, across Mexico?" And he said yes. It was a great pickup line. It worked. So we went hitchhiking together. We didn't know each other at all, and we were just started hitchhiking through Mexico together. I thought it would last 2 weeks with him. It lasted 10 years. We were together for 10 years. So, but that first year we spent hitching down through Mexico, across Central America. We were also doing some other things, working as guides and different things. But we made our way down to Costa Rica. And when we were there, we ended up at a sustainability education center and experimental community out in the rainforest, in a very remote town in the rainforest. And the two founders of this organization asked us to partner with them in the business. So we ended up becoming co-directors of this remote community and education center for about the next 8 years. We were there for 9 years total. Yeah.
Wow. And communal living, because it's interesting when I think about the travel that you've taken, and we've spoken about human interactions along the way, right? And how travel in this way has allowed you to see the goodness in people, and you've had interactions that have been deep. And even with your hitchhiking, people share their stories. But at the root of it, your travel's generally been solo. So then to fast forward and to spend such a long period of your time living as part of a community as well, that's such a stark contrast in a way too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was. The campus was made up of various houses that most of them didn't have any walls. So we were living there as a group, sharing everything. We shared one communal kitchen, and we were facilitating courses for groups of up to 50 students at a time, university students or private schools or individuals. We were very remote, but there were constantly people around. So it was a very intense communal living experience.
And also in the setting that you're at as well. I believe like for 8 of those years you were in the jungle, if I'm right.
Yeah, so and and this is broad strokes of the story. So everyone who was part of that organization would also leave for a couple months, at least a couple months of the year, to go to other places, just because our lives were so intense there. It was so intense. We were facilitating these groups every single day. There was no barrier between your home life or your work life. And so everyone would leave for a couple months of the year. So there were other things going on during that time, but for that whole time we were, fully immersed in this organization. So it was really extraordinary. It was a really special place. It was a really fascinating group of people who wanted to create their own lives, wanted to live by their values, and were able to create this whole livelihood and this whole home out in this remote place and facilitate these really extraordinary educational programs. We would have instructors who were just in the top of their fields teaching classes for us. I also did a lot of curriculum development and facilitated a lot of classes, developed a specialty in live culture fermentation. So I would teach a lot about food processing and fermentation. So it was extraordinary. But there's also a learning curve, and that group, as beautiful and wonderful as it was, I now understand that that group is probably what I would call a high control group, which is a group in which one charismatic person or leader has what's called undue influence over other constituents of the group. So it was really actually not what I would consider now a healthy situation. There was a lot going on there. I did write about this a number of times for different publications. One of those stories is called In Search of the Wild Reindeer, which I wrote for Bicycling Magazine. And so that kind of gets into some of what was happening in this group that made it so unhealthy. But it took a while to understand that, because again, it's like you're going into these places with full engagement and really, like I was so there.
Yeah.
I was all there, and it takes time to recognize sometimes like what when something is not really as healthy as you thought it was. And so I ended up leaving after 9 years there. It went from being this beautiful, extraordinary place to kind of a living nightmare, to be honest. It was not healthy. And so I ended up leaving after 9 years. I went back to the house that I had been living in, our house. And when the founders of this organization were gone, and I had these three old suitcases, and I just like stuffed these suitcases full of clothes and books and dishes, and I left. I just dragged those suitcases out to the gate and I left. And I'm so glad that I did. That was like the one time of leaving where I'm just like, I'm so glad that I left. So again, there is this pattern, I think, for me, of this full engagement in the world, taking it to the edge of what's there, really wanting to understand what is here, what is this world about, who are people, who are we, and getting all the way to that point where it's like, okay, this is not okay, it's time to move on. And so after that, I went back to the United States for a few years, and it was really a tough experience. It was really difficult to recover from that whole situation, and ended up going back to the States. I stayed with friends for a while, which I'm very grateful for. I moved on to a farm that I had a long-standing relationship with, which was really, really wonderful to be able to, kind of transition in that way. And I realized that after a few years, there was just a lot in me that still needed to be processed from this experience of being out in the jungle in this high control group. And so I started to really understand that I needed to do some inner work, and really something had changed, like when really big things happen to you, it changes something inside you. It changes your perception of yourself. It changes your perception of the world and your relationships. And you need to integrate that into your psyche. You need to integrate it into your understanding. And I just hadn't fully done that. And I could tell it was just really weighing on me. And so I realized that I needed to go on a journey again. Like, it was time to go have another journey and really work on this, and spend a lot of time thinking about all of these things that had happened, all these experiences I'd had. It's been such a gift to be able to engage so deeply with this world. My life has been extraordinary, and a lot has happened. And so it's integrating all of that. And so I really set out on this last bike trip to reflect on that and listen to my body, listen to what it was telling me, and really kind of find whatever I needed to find out there.
Wow. And so then this trip, and again, I find that this is something, and we were talking about patterns before. Often there's patterns with people that go on trips like the ones that you've gone on, and they're at a junction and they want to, change tact. There's actually one of my previous guests, around the world traveler, Mackenzie Barney. She rode 29,000 kilometers around the world. She also, before doing that,
I love her.
phenomenal experience. But before doing that, Mackenzie's also had amazing, phenomenal experiences with through hiking, and so doing many, many months through hiking on amazing trails. And she always said that with through hiking, something that you find with people that start on these sort of journeys is that they're looking for answers, or they're seeking a change. And so that seems to be a theme that comes across with the way you're telling your story as well, Laura, that you're seeking change and seeking a new something different, a breakaway from the experience that you've just been immersed in prior, a breakaway from what you've had. You chose to take this trip. It's lasted 8.5 months on your bike now. I said cycling through the UK and Canada, but you chose to start that trip where you ended the trip 15 years earlier on your bike, didn't you?
I did, yeah. So I really wanted to continue the spirit of that original ride. Riding from Alaska down to San Francisco was this moment where I was really going into a certain unknown in my life. And I wanted to continue that. And I wanted to kind of honor that 23-year-old self who had made that choice, because I was so grateful that she did make that choice. I'm so grateful to all of the past iterations of myself for choosing to go on these trips because they have been some of the most extraordinary moments of my life. And so I started in San Francisco. I took the Pacific Coast route down and then I cut across eastward into the desert. I also wanted to spend time in the desert because the desert is just this epic expanse. There's this quality to desert, which is it's windswept, it's bleak. I wanted to go there and I just wanted to like look out at everything that had happened to me and just see what was there and see how it changed my understanding of the world. And so I ended up spending about 3 months out there. After that, I kept going across the desert, passed through Tucson, Arizona, which is where I had actually gotten my start adventuring as an 18-year-old, and then continued on to the Mexican border and started and did the Great Divide northbound, which is what Jen had ridden when I met Jen when I was 23. And so it was this kind of epic route that connected all of these different parts of my life. And it also connected me to people from my life because all along the route, there were all these people who I had met at different moments. And I got to visit these people and stay with them. And so it was just this huge, like, beautiful trip of integration. I had so much fun out there. It was just what I needed. I really feel like a different person, which is, I guess, was the intention.
There are so many places I want to go with your story. And again, Laura, I've said this already a few times, but we could skip ahead and not go into details. But I definitely want to get into the details of some of the stuff that you've just talked about there. I do also want to say how beautiful it is that parts of your trip kept connecting you back to things that were so important through your life journey as well. If you look at your life as a timeline, starting the trip in the place that you set off 15 years earlier, the desert meant something so much to you, so spending so much time there, realizing that human connections were quite impactful, so enjoying the human connections, getting back to Arizona where you set off as an 18-year-old, Jen and
Yeah.
her impact on you to take on the Great Divide. There's so much that I want to go there, but I do actually want to take you to the desert because it's something that I've learnt about myself is how often we have preconceptions about places and they're actually not necessarily true. And my preconception about the desert, I must say, is as an Aussie, and we call our desert the outback, there's not much there, right? And well, but that's not true. So my preconception is the desert is a big expanse of nothing and there's not much there. And through the beauty of this show, speaking to people that have cycled through deserts and had experiences in deserts, they have taught me to challenge that preconception because there's so much there. They talk about the little things that you get to see that you otherwise wouldn't, the small wildflowers and those sort of things, the feeling the presence of such powerful weather and systems. And you spent 3 months in the desert and you actually lived in a cave for 3 months, didn't you, while you were there? Like, when we talk about experiences, Laura, you've had some pretty intense ones. Can you talk me through that? When you started there, did you think you would still be doing this for 3 months? And what was it about the pool of the desert that saw you shift to that type of a lifestyle?
Yeah, I didn't really have a metric for the amount of time I wanted to spend there. It was really more, I wanted to, I was working on some stories at the time and I wanted to complete those stories. And I also just wanted to get to an internal place where I felt like I was ready to move on. So I was so excited to get into the desert. There's this like 50-mile expanse from the mountains outside of San Bernardino where you crossing these mountains and then all of a sudden the whole landscape it slowly starts to shift into desert. And so in the span of this one ride, you go totally from mountains into the desert and then you're in the desert for a long time. So it's this beautiful transformation and it was just so exciting to get out there. And the very first part of the desert experience I actually spent with a friend. My friend Maddie had been riding the Pacific coast as well behind me. She started at a different time and she rode all the way down to the Mexican border and then came and met me out in the desert where I was in Anza Borrego. So we spent the first few days with her, which was perfect because it was just a great experience to share with her and be out there together and go hiking. And then she went back. She had to catch a flight home, and so then I was out there. I had a bunch of water cached out there because there's, you need to be really careful about water out there. And what I would do is I would choose different places on the map. I had a big paper map. I also had a phone with me for the first time ever. I brought a smartphone with me on a bike trip. So I actually had navigation. And I would just choose these little dirt roads to ride out to and find little nooks and crannies in these rocks where I could write. I could work on these stories that I was working on. And so, like, the great thing about Anza Borrego, which is this expanse up the desert, is that it has these rock formations that get kind of eaten away by the wind. And so it creates these shallow caves. They're little like indentations and they're really cool. And they're just, you can kind of like just be in there, kind of like it's an office nook. And so I kind of took my writing in there and I would like pretend I was in an office out in these caves. And it was really fun. It was just a great way to go about that. And, and I was going to different places, biking around, finding these caves, living in them. I lived for a while under a rock as well. I know that sounds strange, but there was a large boulder.
It's so different to like because you were living and you're living so intensely. When you think of the phrase you've been under a rock, it's so.
Yeah, I know. I know. It was a very large, very comfortable rock on a hillside, and it had this like shallow space underneath. And it's so key in the desert because in the desert there can be so much wind and so much exposure. And so these rocks and these shallow caves were actually just like priceless because it provided shade, it provided protection from the wind, and so it was wonderful. I learned to just love these rock formations. And, so the other big thing about being out there, 'cause I was out there for a long time, there were also people. So it wasn't just alone. There was a town that was in the center of this large park that I was in, this wilderness area. And so I could go into town and see people, go to the library. It wasn't like I was just alone the whole time. I was definitely seeing other people too, but then spending a lot of time by myself out in these caves. But really one of the things I wanted to work on out there was really whatever came up. I wanted it to be a blank spot and see what came up. So much had happened. I wanted to learn. I want to always be able to learn from whatever's happens to me or whatever's happening to me, because that's the gift of it, is what you take out of those experiences and how they change you and how they shape you. And so what started to come up for me out in the desert was very unexpected. And so I started to feel this loneliness. I'm not a person who usually feels that lonely because I'm so at home in nature, but I started to feel this loneliness. And I think it was coming from, having left behind these communities that I'd been a part of for a really long time and really processing what had happened and kind of this idea of like, what does it mean to really be connected with people? Like what is that? And so I kind of started to really like sink into this feeling of being alone and loneliness and wondering about that. And it was very uncomfortable and very scary, when you're sitting there in a cave in the desert, you're like, I'm going into the heart of loneliness. I'm going to see what's there.
It's interesting because you speak with such self-awareness there, Laura, where you've been certain of a lot of things for yourself. The certainty of being at one with nature and feeling things deeply, but also to a point, you now are aware that you're lonely. And so then that invites fear as well. It's quite interesting because it's one of those things when you set out solo, you have to be comfortable with your own company. And notwithstanding, as you said, there's people along the way, you have interactions, you're not 100% on your own for weeks and weeks on end. But when the loneliness comes in is when the fear comes in. With that fear, did you ever, I guess, have doubts of continuing? Did you ever think of giving up?
I had a lot of doubts about my choices, for sure. I was like, wow, I've gone out here to be alone. Like, maybe I shouldn't be doing that. Maybe I should have gone to do something else with this time. And so I had to deal with that doubt of like, is it the right choice to be out here studying this feeling, studying these things that are arising in me? And I sat with that too. It was uncomfortable. I sat with that too. And eventually, it started to take shape. It started to take shape what this was. And the paradox of loneliness, I think, is this, that it's a desire to connect. It's a desire to connect with people, with the world. And I started to see it that way. It's like this is a longing for connection, and that's wonderful. That's a beautiful thing, like to be a person who wants to connect with other people. This is good. Like, this is a really good thing. I haven't lost this. And so I started to see it that way, and I started to be really grateful for that. And it also gave me a lot more agency, because I was like, all right, well, now that I know this, I can start to maybe, go into town a little bit more and make some friends. And I started to make friends in town. So there were all these people there that I met, and had these wonderful, ended up having wonderful friendships with. And it really just made me feel a lot more comfortable, though, with the idea of being alone, and also understanding that, you can still be a person who wants to connect with other people and has the capacity for it.
I guess it's through pushing yourself to that feeling of loneliness has solidified that you need those human connections, and has opened you up to making connections again, and sort of changed, I guess, your tact in a little way as well, which is really interesting there. The decision to continue on with your trip then, and to leave that environment, leave the desert caves and continue on, was that sparked at a similar time of coming to grips with the loneliness and moving on? Or was that, like, how did you decide that you were continuing on?
Yeah, so in that process, I ended up finding a lot of connection, and I ended up feeling a lot more connected to everything around me. So I ended up really starting to appreciate every aspect of what was around me, the rocks and the sky and the wind. And it became just a wonderful thing to feel so connected to everything. It was a really special time. So I began to really enjoy that. I began to really dig into that, and I really loved that about that experience. So, and I was becoming happy. I had been through a hard time, and I was becoming happier out there. And I really wanted to, I mean, I just wanted to continue writing, because why not? It's always a good thing. It's always a great thing. And so I left the caves when it started getting hot. And once it started getting really hot, I continued onward, and I just started to become just so happy. I was so happy, because I think sometimes when you are in the process of integrating difficult things, it takes you on a route to joy. And, the integration of all of these experiences always leads to joy. And so I was feeling that a lot on that ride, and through continuing onward to the border and the southern terminus of the Great Divide. By the time I got to the southern terminus of the Great Divide, I was just so happy to be there. And I was so happy to be on that ride and on that route. And I felt so connected to everything. So that whole entire Great Divide route was just so wonderful. It was, it was just like, I loved it. Just every day was such a good day. And yeah, every day was a really good day.
Well, and it's such a different place to be in as well. Like, if I think of, the desert and then the caves, to then move forward, get back on your bike, finding joy in that act of moving forward and discovering places there, to get to the Great Divide route, and then to decide from the southern terminus and head north. It's such a different setting. The Great Divide route, it's a mountainous one.
Yeah.
And I do know you go through New Mexico and there's a different scene there, but you get to some pretty high heights on that route as well. Mountains and valleys and weather systems as well. You said you just found joy on that route, but I imagine you went through all the ups and downs physically and mentally there as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there weren't as many downs on the Great Divide. It was just a really fun time. It was a fun time, and I took really good care of my body. I wasn't in a hurry, so I just went at whatever pace I wanted to go at. I spent a lot of time doing the things I wanted to do, and just really enjoyed it. I think the hardest moment was probably when I got to the halfway point, and I realized it was going to end. I got really low, and I was just like, I've made it halfway and it's gonna have to end. And, like, I really wanted to stay on that route forever. So that was a tough moment, and that was right before entering the Great Basin. So that was in around Rawlins in Wyoming. And after Rawlins, you go through the Great Basin, which is this really long, flat expanse where it's quite a long distance between the next town, and you're going through a very exposed place. And I was a little nervous about it. I was just having a low moment. I was getting nervous about it. And I ended up leaving Rawlins at sunset and starting to ride into the Great Basin at night after dark. And it was totally dark. And I was riding into this area that I had some fear about and just riding into the dark. There were no lights. This is a very remote area. So pitch black. So all I have is my little headlamp on the bike. And it ended up being, again, this wonderful moment. I turned off my light and I looked up, and there were all of these stars. There were so many stars. It was just, you couldn't even imagine that many stars. I'd never seen a sky like that before. It was so beautiful. And it really was this wonderful moment of like, I've come out to this place. I'm dealing with like some of these fears about it. And I'm just love being out here. I love this moment so much. So it was kind of a low that turned into a high. I love the Great Basin.
Two extremes on the emotional scale, being gripped with fear, then, that fear thrusting you into riding in the darkness. Was riding through the night something you'd done prior to this? Like, had you much experience of cycling and continuing in the darkness as well?
Not very much, and I didn't ride the whole night. I just rode for a few hours. I've ridden for a few hours at a time in the dark, and I did as well through the desert. I would sometimes ride at night a little bit because it was so hot out during the day. But it was definitely something that, yeah, it ended up being a really good experience.
Yeah, and then totally flipping that fear on its edge and just being in absolute amazement at this amazing, amazement at this amazing, just being absolutely blown away by the night sky there and the stars. And
Yeah,
oh, I can just picture it now, just the clarity of all those twinkling lights.
yeah,
You mentioned there that it was about halfway through your trip on the Great Divide that you had this realization that the trip was coming towards an end and you didn't want it to end. That's something that's a common theme with
yeah,
many of my guests on long trips. And sometimes it's not until it has ended that they realize that that's the hardest part. It's possibly one of the hardest lessons to try and teach yourself is being content with the end.
yeah.
How did you wrestle with that moving forward, moving to that end point, knowing that you're on something that you want to last forever, but it is going to come to a closure?
Oh, that's such a great question. That's a real human question. I think it's a process. It's a process of accepting it and being grateful for it and, understanding that things will go on in a different way, and you'll have wonderful experiences, and just life is change.
Yeah, and I guess there's also an element, though, Laura, where there's nothing we could do that's going to make us comfortable with that idea, too, is there? One of the hard things about taking trips that last this long is being able to take a trip to last this long. And for many people, the reason why they can't go on a trip that goes this long are varied and different. It might be where they are in life. It might be that they have dependents, they have children, they have partners that, that don't like this form of travel. They don't have enough finances to continue it. And so sometimes the finality of a trip coming to an end is because of those reasons.
Hmm.
Did you set off knowing that this trip would end at that point in time, that it was going to be a finite period of time? Like, did you have things that needed to happen, or were you finding that you were sort of making your days drag out and your movement along to the end of the trail was sort of dragging that out for as long as you could?
That's a good question. Yeah, I didn't know exactly where I was going to end up on this journey. I had an idea that I would maybe do exactly what I did, but I didn't know for sure. I was really feeling it out. I really wanted it to be a really useful trip, and so that was kind of the metric. Yeah, I ended up, yeah, once I got north, it was getting later in the season, and so it's getting a lot colder. Things were starting to freeze up in Canada. So I'd wake up with, my water bottles all frozen. And so it was kind of like I felt like the seasons were telling me it was time to change. And
I'm just thinking what extremes you've had because, like, from having to leave the desert because it's getting too hot to all of a sudden your water bottle's frozen when you get up there in Canada. It's a way that you can tell that you've really traveled through a landscape, isn't it?
Yeah.
You've traveled through not just the landscape, but the seasons have changed in your travels as well.
Yeah.
What do you prefer? This sounds so superficial on how we've been discussing this topic so far, but what is your preference, the hot or the cold?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, I've always been a warm weather person because I lived in the tropics for a long time, so I acclimated down there. So I've always been attracted to that, but I'm interested in cold. I'd like to know what it's like.
Is your interest just the way that you say that, and maybe you haven't thought this out, but does that suggest that perhaps there's another adventure where you're going to push yourself into that environment to discover it more?
I hope so. Yeah, I'm hoping to do actually a polar training course this winter. So I should be getting a lot more exposure to cold and ice fairly soon. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Wow, like whereabouts is that taking place? We were talking about the cold in Canada, but whereabouts is that course going to be?
Yeah, so there is a course happening with a polar adventurer named Eric Larson, and he does a training course out in Minnesota. And so I would be hopefully going out to cover some stories out there. So I've been working as a freelance writer. I was working all throughout the trip, actually. I was also doing some writing and working on stories, and so that's what I transitioned to after Costa Rica, as I kind of reinvented myself as a adventure writer.
Fully remote too, like a proper digital nomad in a way, in that way, isn't it? But adventuring on your bike. Is that how you see your lifestyle moving on and moving forward as well? In that sort of adventure space?
Yeah, I love writing. I love telling stories, and I love really digging into the internal experiences of what this is like. It's a fascination for me. I'm fascinated by how people change, and that's what a lot of my adventures have been about. It's something that I intentionally kind of study what's happening to me on these journeys internally because I enjoy telling the story about it because I think it is such a human story that's applicable to everyone. Everyone is going through something, everyone is changing, everyone is shape shifting. So these are just human stories. So I'm really excited about moving forward with that.
I guess then, Laura, if people want to find out more about your writings and your adventures, how can they keep track of that and how can they, I guess, follow your journey along in this way?
Yeah, so while I was writing, I actually started a newsletter. So I have a website called laurasstories.live. And then there's a newsletter that I started, and I hope people will sign up for the newsletter. This is where I'm going to keep updates about different adventures that I'm going on, as well as different projects that I'm working on, and resources for people to help get people outside. I'm always interested in sharing these stories and experiences because I hope that they're relevant to people. I hope they're useful for people. I kind of think of a lot of the emotionally driven stories that I write as almost like little road maps. So, like, if people get lost somewhere, they can kind of, hopefully come across a story about someone going through something complicated and kind of find their way using the story. So, I don't know. Yeah, I hope people will sign up for the newsletter.
Absolutely. And I will definitely, for my listeners, put links to that in the show note as well. So if it's something that you're interested in, you can click on that and follow Laura along the way there too. And Laura, you're also on Instagram. What is your Instagram channel there as well?
Yes, I'm on Instagram and Facebook at Laura Killingbeck. So it's just at Laura Killingbeck, my name.
Easy. And I'll add links to that as well. I want to take you back briefly onto the Great Divide Trail, Laura. And that is to say that you found yourself heading south to north on this trail, just as actual races of the Great Divide route were heading north to south, didn't you? So you actually got to meet some of people adventuring at speed, so to speak, on your slow transformative journey as well, didn't you?
I did, yes. I met so many wonderful people. It was so fun to see the riders. And it was a big moment for me to see these people doing this race because it really reminded me of Jen, who I had met earlier in my life, who had just raced the Great Divide. And one of the the really hard things that, Jen ended up passing away a few years after I met her. And so I never really got a chance to tell her what an impact she had on my life. And so I think meeting these riders, being able to cheer for them, I just cheered so loudly I kind of lost it. I was just like, I just was like, you are.
It's such a mental boost to have a cheering squad. It really, really is.
I gave it my all. I really did. And it was just so beautiful to see these people pushing themselves and finding that kind of inner infinity to keep going on this race. I absolutely loved meeting these people. And racing is not my thing. It's not my metric, but I understand that it's other people's. And so I think it's beautiful.
I recently interviewed April Drage, an Australian. She actually rode the Great Divide route, and I wonder whether or not you came across her and whether your paths connected or crossed in this trip as well. And April is amazing and phenomenal and has done so well in these races before as well. But she turns up to the start line, but she does it because she just loves being immersed outside in nature. And this is the format that she does that in. Whereas she says to herself, I think she'd be happy for me to say this, she's not competitive whatsoever. So the reason she's at the pointy end of the field is because she's just traditionally not a great sleeper. So she doesn't see a point in lying awake and not sleeping. So she just keeps moving forward. And so she covers vast distances during the day.
Wow.
But I think something that you have in common with her, Laura, is that she just loves every moment of being out there and experiencing nature as well.
Yeah.
Do you ever think you could ever, like, would you ever, not in a competitive sense, but would you ever see yourself on a bicycle covering vast, vast distances day after day just to see what that experience is like?
I don't know. I'm sure I'd love to try it sometime, but it's never been what I've naturally been drawn to. But yeah, I'm interested in extremes in general. So it's, yeah.
It's interesting though, and again, if we reflect back to what we started with when we were talking about that first bike, the first bike you bought, you remember so fondly, it's a touring bike. And if I think of your life has had so many learnings come towards you as a culmination of taking yourself somewhere through bicycle travel on a tour somewhere, do you see touring as something that's going to be a constant in your life? Or do you see it as something that you'll do here and there? Like, do you have plans for another trip at all?
Yeah, so I try to take either a long distance biking or hiking trip either every year, every other year if I can. So I've also ridden around Costa Rica and across Ecuador and Colombia. I've also done some long hikes the Florida Trail and along long sections on the Appalachian Trail. So I try to, it's a permanent part of my life to get out there. I think it's a reset. It's a way where I just feel really grounded. I feel like I can really reorient myself and align myself with nature. So I'm always looking for ways to be outside on these journeys. I love it.
I can't ever see you as the sort of person that could be content not having nature in the outdoors as something that plays such a significant role in your life. Just from what you've shared with me in this short time and what I've seen, in learning about your story, the outdoors is a constant theme. I feel like there's no way you could ever leave that behind. What's it been like then to have this transition of not being outside 7 days a week, having those experiences? Like we talked about, obviously you've got forward plans and you're immersing yourself in, you've got this course that's coming up that's going to teach you some new skills, but what's it like in the in-between time now? How have you found sitting in a different zone, not being traveling? How has that been for you?
Yeah, I think the shift in exercise, less exercise is always a challenge, but I also love being home. I love just like quiet things. I'm a pretty chill person, so I also really appreciate home life. I lived for a long time on farms and communities, and I love that lifestyle as well as really digging into one place. There's a huge amount of adventure in one place. Like I don't think that you have to go far or anywhere to find adventure. I think it's more about the mindset of engaging and being curious about something and just really being there with wherever you are. So I love home life too. I think the thing about adventure, at least long distance adventures, there's just so much about it that is unique. But I think especially I'm very attracted to that, the exercise and the breathing and the outdoor time. So it's a balance. It's always looking for the balance between the two.
Oh, I can imagine. If you were then, Laura, say someone listens to this and hearing your story inspires them to seek adventure in this way, a total novice, what advice of yours would you put in their pannier bag, so to speak? What would you say to them?
Oh yeah, I think the biggest thing is I think everyone gets to create their own metric for adventure. Whatever is important to you, whatever is meaningful, whatever is exciting to you, then that's where to go with it. What like it doesn't have to be someone else's version. It can be whatever you want it to be. And I think people can start in their own backyard. I actually camp out in my friends' yards all the time. Part of my tapering off from these trips is to go and visit friends and camp out and bike to their house and camp out in their yard.
That's awesome.
Yeah, taper down a little,
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah.
It's like a mini adventure.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I'm in one spot for a long time, sometimes I'll just I keep like a bag ready. So sometimes I'll just get home in the evening and go on a mini adventure overnight and then just bike into work in the morning. So there's a lot of ways of putting adventure into your life. People lead a lot of different lifestyles. They have a lot of different realities, but there are ways to fit it in. And yeah.
Laura, I could talk to you for ages and unravel so many of your adventures, and I know that I can't. So I definitely need to wrap this up. I have a few quick fire questions which I do ask all of my guests. The first one, I actually think it's possibly one of the hardest questions I get to ask people. It's music related. I'm putting together a playlist of my Seek Travel Ride guests, which is quite eclectic. There's different artists, different genres in this playlist now, but it's a song that each of my guests has chosen to, for lack of a better word, be the soundtrack to their adventure. If you could pick one song to be Laura Killingbeck's soundtrack, what would that song be?
Oh, so for this adventure, this long trip, which was so meaningful in so many ways, I chose Home in Your Heart by Elephant Revival. I love that song. It's beautiful.
Is music something that you would listen to? Like, did you listen to music during your time away?
Not really. This is actually the first time I've ever had music available. For most of my trips, I didn't go with a phone or anything.
It's a real raw experience.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But I did have a little bit of music on me this trip, which was new and really fun.
I've got you down there, Home in Your Heart. That is your song. Okay, final two questions. The first one, you're given a choice of one day and you're going to be pedaling forever up a constant climb, or the alternative is to pedal into a continuous headwind. Which of these two would you be choosing?
Climbing. I love climbing. Yeah.
Climbing. There's no hesitation whatsoever in your choice there.
I love a long climb. Yeah.
Were you always that way, or did it take the Great Divide to push you into a climber?
I've always loved like a long, like, yeah, I love a long climb. Yeah, always. It just, you get in the zone. I don't go fast. I just like buckle in and just, I'm in it for the ride. I love it.
Actually, it really reminds me of one of the quotes that you had that I came up with yours, and it's all about the beauty of slow travel. One great advantage of going slow is enjoying going slow. When the going gets tough, I just eat a snack, watch a cloud, and then keep slogging onward. That to me is almost like the epitome of a long, constant, endless climb.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. Okay, final question for you, Laura. And it's going to be interesting to hear your answer on this one. You're going to be riding your bike just for 4 hours. I realize it's not a lot of time, but it's 4 hours of bike riding on this day. And you can choose whether or not you want to ride that bike for 4 hours on your own or for 4 hours with other people. Which one are you going to choose?
Oh, that's a great question. It's totally contextual. I think some days I'd go by myself, some days I'd go with people. I've done a lot of solo riding, so I'm very comfortable with that. I also do love humans. I love people, and so I would say maybe it depends on the day.
Oh, what would push you into having to cycle with other people then? Like, what would it be that would make you choose not to be on your own? It's my nice way of pushing you off the fence.
Yeah, you're a good interviewer.
Oh, thank you.
um, yeah. Yeah, so I mean, I have cycled with people. So I cycled across Ecuador and Colombia with people, across Costa Rica and part of the Pacific coast. And those were always great experiences. Those were actually some of my favorite experiences were with other people. I do love traveling by bike with other people. So yeah, I don't know. I think they've all been good experiences. Yeah. I'm not answering your question.
No, you're not. You're not. I'm going to let you sit on that
I
one.
don't know how.
I'm going to let you sit on the fence. I don't often do that, so I'm just going to.
Yeah.
I'm going to be magnanimous today. Laura, you can have one hand in
Thank
both
you.
camps.
Okay.
For that though, I have one more question now for you. So this is my reasoning. Laura, you've experienced so much. To cover it all is almost nigh on impossible. In fact, I would say it's impossible. But if I got to ask you another question, it would be, what's a question that I haven't asked you that I should have asked you? What would you tell me?
Ooh, that you should have asked me. Wow, I think. Well, I mean, you're an excellent interviewer, so you've gotten to the heart of the story. So yeah, I think another question about this journey. I think well, a lot of these experiences are intense. I have an intense life in a strange way, but there's also a lot of joy here and just so much happiness and so much carefree spirit in a lot of ways. Like you have to have that in order to want to go on these trips. You're riding towards something. And so a lot of that for me is when you look really directly at some of these intense experiences, they can seem kind of funny. Like there's an absurdity to it. And so I think that appreciating that absurdity and appreciating like the humor of it. Like there was a moment out in the desert, when I was going through my loneliness phase and like dealing with that and starting to feel connected with everything around me, where I kind of found this rock out in the desert. And it was just like this boulder that was way out in this flat expanse. And I ended up just kind of like climbing on top of this rock. And I had my camera with me. I set it up the tripod. And so I took a picture, and the picture that ended up being my favorite was of me just like lying face down on this rock. It looks like I'm like have given up, like it's like total dejection. But it ended up being just this great moment where I was just like, I'm so happy on this rock. And so I think like that is part of the story too, of there are these moments which are intense and also funny, and it's all happening at once. And so, the further question is always probably about that, like what brings out that absurdity, what brings out the humor in these situations as well, because there's always a lot of that too.
I love that, Laura, because it's one of those things where you look at your story and with a serious mindset, and we wouldn't be incorrect to do that. But there's such a sense of humor that comes out. I mentioned your Instagram handle before, and I would definitely invite my listeners to check it out because, Laura, it's something I've picked up on in your posts when you talk about something so intensely, but there's also that sense of humor that you slip in there as well. And I really, really love that too. So I think that's a perfect answer to my extra little question that I got to ask because you sat on the fence. Laura Killingbeck, it has been an absolute pleasure. I've loved digging into your story. I feel you live your life with intention, purpose, and you are a curious soul. You ask yourself the questions while you're in this immersive experience of yours. I am definitely keen to keep an eye on your future adventures. Thank you so much for sharing your story with Seek Travel Ride.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been lovely chatting with you, Bella.
It was an absolute pleasure to be able to chat there with Laura and dig into her amazing story. I've said this a few times during the podcast. I feel I could do a podcast series on Laura's story. She's lived a life full of such varied experiences, and the learnings that she's taken along the way I love the self-awareness that she has and that curiosity which has beckoned her on in her adventures to travel in this way and to keep learning more about herself as well. When she had that realization that being lonely meant that she had a thirst for human connections and that was a good, joyful thing, I really appreciated how deep that went for Laura. And I thank her for being a guest of Seek Travel Ride. To all my listeners, thank you for supporting the show. Thank you to my super fans. You're the ones who get in touch, leave me voicemails, join the Facebook group, and also share the story and the show with your friends and family. You're the reason why this show keeps growing week on week, and I am so appreciative of your support. If you want to get in touch with me, send me an email. My email address is podcast@seektravelride.com. And also, lastly, make sure you're following the show in your podcast player app so you get notified when a new episode gets released every week. Until the next episode, my name's Bella Malloy. Thanks for listening.